Welcome to Aging in Recovery. I'm Gil Singtron, licensed master social worker and founder of Never Alone Home Care Services Incorporated. Welcome, Pico. Welcome to Aging in Recovery. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and chat with me about this very important subject. I worked with your mother in the 1980s in East Harlem politics, and I've known you since you were a young kid. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you and how did you wind up here?
Well, actually, you started working with my mother in the late 70s because that's when I met you. So it was the late 70s. But you're one of the people that I appreciate that you can mention my mother. And how I ended up where I am. I'm a product of Spanish Harlem, El Barrio. I'm from 109th Street and Madison Avenue. I grew up there. I went to school there. I was part of the parochial school system, Catholic schools, right? I went there for 12 years. And, we just, I just grew up, regular. I was relatively a good kid, but no different than many others in our community. That a lot of us did different things. Some of us just went on the deeper end, and then there's some of us that believe it or not, there's people today that they could get a drink, they could smoke a joint, they could do something like that, and it's nothing to them. I wasn't one of those people. I wasn't one of those people. So my early upbringing, was I went to Commander Shea, Commander Shea, which was on 111th Street, right? And then that closed down. Then I went to St. Cecilia, which was on 106th Street, all in El Barrio. My world was very small. East Harlem was my world, right? And then I ended up going to a all boys Catholic high school, right? But in those years, it wasn't strange for me to see drug addicts and alcoholics. It wasn't strange to see it. It wasn't strange to see it, because drugs and alcohol, damaged our community. It just took over. It wasn't anything. I started, but I started very, very young. Drinking very young, in my household, not knowing that I was drinking, I was just emulating my parents and everything. Friday night, my father come home with a bottle of Bacardi, they sit down, they drink, they get drunk and everything. And, I would get up and whatever's left in the sink, I'll be like, because I would hear them. And I'm taking watered down drinks, not knowing that I'm actually using, and then I started the first time I used an illegal drug. What I know now is an illegal drug was smoking weed, right? Smoking, marijuana, right? 10 years old. 10 years old. Nothing strange about it. Nothing strange about it, because the person who came to me was another 10-year-old kid, a kid that I grew up with, that I'm still friends with. And look at what he told me. He goes, Pico, look what I took from my father. Yeah, look what I took from. Now I already knew what weed smelled like. I knew about bamboo. I knew about, how people bought marijuana and everything like that. So without hesitation, without any fear or anything like that, I said, yeah, let's go smoke it. Not knowing what I was doing. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what I was doing. And what we had to do, we had to get matches. Back then, right now you go to a store, a kid goes to a store and goes, yo, I need some matches. They're gonna, these bodegas are gonna go, what you need matches for? Mm-hmm. Right? But for me, it was nothing. I bought cigarettes for my parents regularly as a kid. Pico, go downstairs, go get a pack of L&Ms, a pack of Marlboros and everything like that. And all I did was go to the bodega and say, yo, mommy needs a book of matches. The line right away, the line to use. Check that out, man. I just started, the line to use, So I say, yo, mommy needs a book of matches. Okay, Pico, está bien, toma. And they give it to me. And we proceeded to go smoke a joint for the first time. So and it wasn't anything that I did regularly, my first couple years with it, but maybe by the time I turned 13, late 12, 13 years old, I was smoking pot on a regular basis, and I was drinking already. Because we go to the park, man. It was nothing to go to a store and buy a quart of beer. They didn't care. All you had to do was say, yo, this is for my father, or this is for my mother. That's it. They didn't question us. Today, they get questioned. So we smoking pot regularly and drinking regularly. So it progressed. I was willing to try anything. And when I was 23, I stopped using drugs when I was 23 years old. Right? I'm going to be 65 years old in a couple of weeks. I've been part of the recovery process for over 41 years. I haven't used a drink or a drug in over 41 years. And I'm actually aging. I'm getting older. I worked in the construction field for 37 years, So, things like, I got hurt at work, knee replacement, my back hurts, my shoulders hurt, I've had a number of injuries over the years. At one point, I was morbidly obese. And all these things happened after I got clean. Actually, after I got clean. Because after I got clean, that's when I really got big.
Now, let's talk about aging in recovery. My argument is that there's no services for people aging in recovery because people aging in recovery we all age, but we have different needs. People in recovery have different needs. One specifically being connected to the recovery community.
Right.
So, taking all that into consideration, with your experience with your father in the nursing home, do you see a need for the program that I am trying to develop?
Yeah, part of it, Gil, is, like when we came into the virtual platform, right? We started seeing people that we haven't seen in a while. This is something, if they could stay connected virtually, and be part of this process, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. My experience with, dealing with somebody that ended up in a nursing home and everything like that was, my father. My father came to live with me from Puerto Rico. He stood with me for 10 years. He stood with me for 10 years. He was a very, yeah, and he was very difficult with me. He wasn't loving, he wasn't caring or anything like that. I got better with him when I accepted the fact that, what, he can't give me something that he doesn't have. So I just either accept who he is. And so, eventually he ended up in a nursing home. Eventually he ended up in a nursing home, right? Because he needed more than I can give medically and everything like that. He needed some constant supervision and everything like that. And I had to go to work and everything. So I know a number of guys that have ended up in nursing homes.
And you brought up that nursing home situation, which is perfect because another member told me that they go visit somebody in a nursing home and all the person is doing is sitting there looking out the window like a vegetable, like in that movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Mm-hmm. And I believe that if we had a recovery centric nursing home where everybody is geared toward recovery, the doctors, the nurses, they're familiar with recovery, so that people that are there, the patients or whatever they want to call them, patients, residents, whatever they call them, could be themselves. What we've been taught for all these years is to share our experiences, to not bottle things up inside of us. So sharing, I remember this guy that we extended their life. Remember Manny? We extended his life for 2 years. At the end, he died from cancer in the brain. But we extended his life for 2 years by fellowshipping with him. And he actually came to one of our barbecues. He came to my apartment and visited me one time. And then he died. Mm-hmm. And he was in a nursing home during the pandemic. So that's what started getting me geared and mentally that we need this type of service. Mm-hmm. And that's the important part that I want to talk about. You mentioned people that were unable to get around to make meetings, and luckily we had the virtual platform. But some of those people are going to get even older. Well, eventually they are going to get older.
And today's the youngest I'm ever going to be.
That's right. Today's the youngest I'm ever going to be. Yeah, they're going to get old. We're going to get older. And eventually some of us are going to wind up either in nursing homes, assisted living. And even before we get there, there's people right now that need home attendants. Mm-hmm. So home attendants are not trained for recovery situations. And I don't think that they need to be social workers or clinical people to be aware of certain signs that could lead to relapse. People become isolated, they become depressed, and if a person that was a home attendant was aware of those signs, they could say, let's go to a meeting, or let me log on to a virtual meeting, or why don't we read something from one of the spiritual books? It could be the big book, it could be the basic text, it could be any of those recovery literatures to get the person grounded and centered again. So those type of services that I call recovery-centric services.
Yeah, something that's needed for the recovery process. Yeah, it is needed for the recovery process. I got a real good friend right now that's struggling horribly, and he doesn't want to be part of it. But he's struggling hard. He's struggling, and he gets a home attendant. They come by, every single day and everything like that. And those home attendants, they just realize, oh, he's just cranky. But you and I might look at it as, yo, man, he needs an outlet. He needs an outlet to talk about what's going on. So it's necessary. It can be done, but it's gonna take some work.
Well, that's my job, getting
Yes.
it done. Thousands of people across the country, people from California, Baltimore, Florida, Puerto Rico, they really support this concept. So I know that it's gonna happen. It's just a slow process. And you know me for long enough. I started so many different entities that when I put my mind on it, I'm gonna make sure it happens. And this is something that I'm really focused on. And what happens with people our age with long-term recovery, a lot of them relapse due to medication. And that's something that troubles me.
So if you ask me, this is definitely necessary. It's necessary for the recovering person. It is, because a lot of them are alone. A lot of them are alone, that their families are just like, yeah, I'll go see him once a week, or I'll go see her once a week. And, it starts off with, I'm going every day, then it's going once a week. And before you know it, it's a couple of months before they have any interactions. And then, if we're not exercising our minds, recovery wise, we forget about it. We forget about it. And then you know what? This hurts, man. Here, take this pill. Because doctors are quick to prescribe stuff, right? And nurses are like, here, take this. And and if we forget that we hear about people, relapsing off of medication, we be like, oh yeah, I'll take it. Let me take this. Let me take it. And before you know it, they maybe not so much out in the street doing it, but they back in the mix. To me, one of the most important things, Gil, is, to try and stay connected with somebody in the recovery process. With somebody, just staying connected with somebody. It could be, for some people, it could be just one person. If you're lucky enough to, to make, to go to the, the 12-step programs and everything like that. If you're lucky enough to go to the, literally, you're lucky. As you're older. But we see with our own eyes, when we go to these places and we see older members, and they're not the same. They're not the same. They're not getting, it's almost like yeah, I'm here, that's it. I think about my boy Duke, man, he's struggling. He's struggling. And they get to the point that they go, I want to die.
To wrap it up, I want to thank you for sharing your experience, and talking about this new concept that I'm trying to develop. I hope you spread the word and keep it going. Thank you for watching Aging in Recovery. If you find these conversations meaningful, please like, subscribe, and follow the channel as we continue exploring aging in recovery, the invisible cohort, recovery-informed care, and the future of long-term recovery in America. And please, leave your thoughts and comments below. It's time we begin the conversation.